Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's live stream of Ursula Dubosarsky, Agents of Choice, which the Wheeler Centre presents in partnership with the Australian Children's Laureate Foundation. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that today's conversation is taking place across unceded sovereign land. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Kulin Nation, and Ursula Dubosarsky joins us from the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. We pay respect to these communities' elders past and present, and to the elders of all communities and cultures this conversation reaches. Ursula Dubosarsky is the Australian Children's Laureate for 2020 to 2021. She has written over 60 award-winning books for children and young adults and won multiple awards, including nominations for the International Hans Christian Andersen and Astrid Lindgren Awards for Children's Literature. My name is Bec Kavanagh, and I'm the Schools Programmer for the Wheeler Centre, a writer and an academic. Thank you so much, Ursula, for being here, and welcome.
Great pleasure. Thank you. Pleasure for me. So I'm delighted to be speaking with you and with everybody who's joined us.
Thank you. Look, I thought to get us started, I would like to get a bit of an overview from you about your role as the Children's Laureate. So can you perhaps tell me what excited you about the opportunity when you were first approached for it?
Well, when I was first approached, I suppose I was just a bit shocked. And I guess like most people, my response to unexpected opportunities is just like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. So in a sense, I agreed to it from the heart without, a lot of deep consideration, but just a kind of instinct that surely that would be a good thing to do, and how fantastic to be offered to be able to do it. And then it was a matter of sitting down and thinking about what I might like to be able to achieve during the 2 years as Children's Laureate. For people who don't know, the Children's Laureate has been going for in Australia, it's an international movement, you might call it, but it's been going in Australia for about 10 years. And I am I think the 6th laureate, because there were 2 right at the very beginning. And the idea of the laureate is that a person like myself who's a writer or an illustrator for children in Australia, who's published quite a lot, works as a sort of champion of children's reading. It's about promoting and championing children's reading and doing everything we can to make reading central to the lives of children in Australia. So that's what it is, and each laureate has a kind of chance to think of a project that they want to concentrate on. And my particular project that I decided to concentrate on was, after a lot of thinking about what really turned me into a sort of, very committed reader from a pretty young age, as soon as I was able to learn to read when I was about 6. And that was having access to a lot of books, like a lot of books. And obviously those books were not in my home. There's not enough, even if you were fabulously wealthy, you're not going to have all the books in your home that can turn a child into a real reader. But that's the public library. For me, it was the public library in combination with my various fantastic school libraries. And because a couple of the other laureates had worked quite a bit promoting school libraries, I thought, well, look, for my laureateship, while I will also obviously be promoting the wonders of our beautiful school libraries, which in some instances are really under threat and undervalued, I also decided I would really work to promoting public libraries and particularly encouraging all children to join their local public library. And so in that way, to become used to being exposed to a lot of books through which they could slowly learn to develop their own taste in what they wanted to read. So that's, again, sorry, Bec, I went off charging ahead there with my long answer to your question.
Don't be sorry, I love a long answer. I should say as well that some of my questions today have come from our audience. So thank you everybody who submitted. if you're watching this and you would still like to submit questions, you can drop them into the live chat and I can ask them to Ursula as we go. Ursula, why do you think it is so important for kids to have access to so many books? Like, why is a little handful? You've mentioned before in an interview that your dad's library was a box of books under his teacher's desk. Why is it important to have more than that box?
Look, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think I'm remembering also my mother telling me that they had no books at home when she was a child. They had one book, which was Alice in Wonderland. And one year at school, she won a prize and she was unbelievably excited because she was going to get a book. And she just burst into tears because it was, in fact, the same book, Alice in Wonderland. So that's a tragic story. So when my parents were children, of course, the great and magnificent public library system of Australia had not fully kicked into action because it was enacted around World War II, and then it didn't really take off until after the war. So my parents didn't really have access to public libraries when they were children, and so they would have been dependent on school libraries, which, as we were just saying, were also not a given in any school. And that it also, I think, is a post-war phenomenon where schools started to see that reading is central to all education, and that every school must have a library to symbolize, at the very least, to the children how central reading is to their education and how important the school thinks reading is. In terms of the access to the lots of books, my tragic mother with her one book, I think when we want children to become good readers, and by good readers, I guess I mean someone who can pick up a great variety of literature and can confidently know they're going to be able to read it, that they're not going to not pick up a book because they're not going to be able to read it because they've had very little reading experience. And also, by a good reader, I guess I mean a self-motivated, happy reader, someone who wants to read. And human motivation being what it is, we can tell children that they must read and that it's very important to read, and it's central to their education, and everybody must read and write and all that sort of thing. But if we want children to read of their own will, they have to want to read themselves. And I think the humankind is so various, and the interests and complicated personality types out there are just like every fingerprint is a different person, obviously, and a different mind, that I think to be able to give access to children to a lot of books, that they can experiment very freely and widely. They can pull books down, take them home, may find them all really boring, bring them back, go and find some others, and find them in an almost not willful, but when you're a child and you're walking up and down the aisles of a library, you just pull any old book out because you sort of don't really know what you like. So there's this almost random, or it might be the slightest thing that attracts you to a book, and there's this sense of discovery and gradual development of your own taste, so that not only do you know the sorts of books you like, but when you pull a book out that you don't like, you can you have a kind of way of saying to yourself, or indeed to someone else, why you don't like it. So it's also the formation of taste is also a kind of formation of critical faculties, and I think that is what makes great readers, that they will see reading as an adventure, as something very stimulating and exciting, something that they want to do. So I think, to me, the library, where you can make bad choices again and again and again of books that you don't like, and it's not going to cost you anything, and also it's a long-term process, a library. I was saying to somebody, a friend of mine whose daughter doesn't like to read, just take her to the library, join her up, and just tell her to pick one single book in that entire library. She doesn't have to like it. Just pick one book and, get them to take it home. And then do the same thing the next week and the next week and the next week. It's just this sort of patient thing. And in the end, that child will find at least one book in that library that they like and that they want to read another one. And that sense, I suppose, of, as you were saying, or perhaps it was the brief about today's session, that sense of, agency, ownership of your reading, that it's not someone telling you to read.
Absolutely. So. And I mean, the stakes are, no, don't apologize for any answers, please. If you want to
interrupt
talk for the next 45 minutes, then go nuts. No, look, I think that the stakes aren't as high in a library, are they? In the sense of, as a parent, we're not like, you got to read this book from cover to cover because I paid good dollars for it.
The parent can just be disappointed, can't they? They buy them a book that they like and the kid doesn't like it. So then the reading is almost associated with feeling guilty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is not what you want. Yeah.
No.
Sorry, please go on.
Please stop apologizing. I mean, look, there is so much that I want to talk about from what you've just said. I want to first talk about how we can support the libraries. You mentioned that sense of almost enchantment and wonderment of going into a library, and it made me think of when I was a kid, going back and back again to Joan Aiken's book, Tales of a One-Way Street. And I reckon I could still find it on my old primary school library shelf, even though it was, 35 years ago now. So how important are those physical books to us? Like, and do you think, well, in fact, how important are they to us? And how important are they even more so in this space of isolation and lockdown that we find ourselves in?
Look, it's a great point, isn't it? Because some, not exactly critics of libraries, but some people will say we don't need a library now because it's all on devices and it's sort of a waste of space having these dusty, germ-ridden books on the shelves. But that's such a beautiful memory that you said about Joan Aiken's book and where it was on that shelf, because as soon as you said that, I had this vision of in my primary library, of the half dozen Joan Aiken books all lined up there, beautifully covered in plastic, and just that sort of frisson of excitement that there they were, and they were always there in a sense, unless someone had borrowed them out. They kind of belonged in the place. And I think it's so true that physical books, people do, even if they're not going to read them, they have a kind of, I don't know, animal response to them, or a visceral response of comfort. I mean, I often think, the reason a lot of people go to the library and like to sit there, whatever they're doing, is because they enjoy being surrounded by books. It's a kind of comfort. And if you go into a library that's extremely clean and just has a few banks of machines to tap in, it's not a place where you feel you want to be. Whereas there's something about rooms full of books that people, even if they don't read, feel a kind of human warmth, because libraries are full of this human warmth. All of those books are sort of these products of human activity over thousands of years. So it's a kind of, you feel some sort of, centering of yourself or something in the book. And look, I think the thing about the electronic books, and I'm sure you, and I'm sure probably everybody listening today reads electronic books, and aren't they fantastic? You've got all these books in your phone, you're never without a book. It's brilliant. But I won't speak about adults who still love paper books, because I know the majority of readers still do love paper books because the sales indicate that. But with children in particular, children, for whatever reasons, I mean, I've got no theories as to why, but they want to hold a physical book. And I think if there are not physical books on the shelf for children to pick up and, open and turn and flip through. When I was a child, I shouldn't admit this to librarians, but I used to eat the books. That was part of my pleasure. I was probably sort of had some terrible condition, but it was part of my pleasure of the physical book was I ate them, and I knew the flavor of each book. Like, it's something about how you relate to a book. And I think if you don't have books on the shelves accessible to children, what that means is they won't read. they won't sit there on their phone and read a book. They'll sit there on their phone, as we know, and they will read things, but they won't read a book. So if you don't have a library with books in it, then the children won't be reading. So I think that's just something that I feel, and it's also that sense of a library as a kind of place of free expression, of exploration. I mean, I suppose that's why in some ways I love the public libraries, because on the whole, when you go to a public library to borrow a book, it's not associated with school, which for some children, the association of school and books can be a sense of failure, or a sense of that's not for me, or a sense of even surveillance, whereas there's a kind of anonymity in the public library where you can reinvent yourself, I suppose. Maybe in the school you're, regarded as someone who's bad at reading or naughty or
and I think
whatever.
As you're older, you definitely feel more able to experiment more in public libraries, because as you say, you're anonymous, you're not necessarily
friends. For teenagers, your friends, your peer group. What a good point. The peers, whereas you can be alone in the public library. That's really true. Yeah.
You reminded me of that beautiful anecdote from Maurice Sendak, who received fan mail and he wrote back to it, and then the mother responded asking if he could write again, because I think the child, she said something like, he loved it so much, he loved your letter so much that he ate it. And I think maybe that was you as a child, eating the words that you loved.
Well, it wasn't me, but I could have, I guess. Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Now, you've talked about the kind of power and importance of physical books in a library. And I'm sure that given an audience of librarians, this will be in some ways preaching to the choir. However, we have had some questions come in around how we can kind of fight for the importance of librarians and the other kind of elements of a library to governments, to funding bodies, perhaps even to education bodies. So I'm wondering if you could give us a bit of a nutshell about what you think a library is. Like, it's more than just books, surely. What is it? What does it need?
Well, I guess what I feel is a misunderstanding sometimes about what a library is, and this is sometimes raised, well, not sometimes, but frequently raised as a reason as to why we don't need libraries, is they're almost seen as just an alternative, an old-fashioned alternative to Google. They're sources of information. And now we can find out our information other places. We don't have to, go to the Encyclopedia Britannica in the library. And yet, the fact is, I mean, if you look at public library statistics, the great majority of items borrowed in public libraries are fiction. People go to libraries to nourish their imagination. There are, of course, certain kinds of libraries, such as university libraries and scientific libraries, that are research libraries. But if you're just talking generally about libraries, and certainly my association of school libraries as a child was totally like yours. It was this sort of, cauldron of the imagination and of fiction. And there was non-fiction also in the library, and you would do your projects, and it was helpful for the curriculum and all of that sort of thing. But I think in terms of making children love reading, I think it's important to emphasize that sort of centrality of imaginative reading in the lives of children, and that the library is the sort of the place where that is both symbolically happens and really happens. And for some children, particularly obviously for children who don't have books at home, the library is a sort of wonderful source of the nurturing and nourishing of those huge imaginative capacities of children that are in all children. And it's just a matter of it's a matter of opportunity. They certainly won't read if they don't have the opportunity to read, and the library provides the opportunity where children will read because it also obviously supports teachers in the curriculum and is a source of information and does those things. But it is a kind of a social room where reading happens and reading is valued.
Yeah, it needs to be used. It needs to be open, doesn't it? They can't just be a storage locker for books.
No, and I've been to a few, as all children's writers would have, I've been to a few school libraries like that where they open it up once a year in Book Week when the author comes and you all squeeze in amongst the basketball hoops. It's just, so the school might very well say, oh, we've got a library. But it's a sort of dead space, and the children don't feel like they belong in it. I guess what I love about libraries in schools and children's libraries in the public library system is that there are these spaces that shout out to children that you belong in here. This place is for you. We want you in here. Here are all these books, and these books are for you. They're not, and they're for your pleasure and happiness. They're not sort of threatening. I think that's, obviously for some children and some families, books do become almost menacing, a source of failure and punishment. And I suppose particularly an anxiety, I guess. And I suppose the ideal library is one that is not about anxiety, but it's about support and liberty and childhood.
And so how do you think that librarians right now, public librarians and school librarians, can work together to support parents to create those same safe and imaginative spaces, perhaps at home? And what are the challenges in doing so when parents are potentially working, looking after other kids, don't have the funds or access? Do you have any thoughts about how we can kind of transfer that space across, I suppose?
Well, I think, it will be, and I know many do, wonderful if school librarians also encourage children to join their local public library and, have excursions to the local public library, because many children wouldn't even think they were allowed in there. They wouldn't know, they'd sort of walk past it and think it was some place you couldn't go in, and wouldn't even know that you can get a library card and you can borrow books for free, and that, you will be welcomed there. It's a place that belongs to the public. So I think, and I know librarians do support each other enormously that way for children's reading. And look, I suppose in terms of supporting parents, it would be also reassuring parents that parents, I know a friend of mine in Canberra was telling me she works a lot with refugee families, and the parents were very anxious that there would be sort of punitive costs involved if books were overdue and things like that, and they would sort of forbade their children to join the library out of a kind of fear of some sort of social revenge by using this public resource. So I guess it's a matter of just, I was brought up going to public libraries. So to me, as soon as I walk in a library, I just feel I'm at home. I feel it belongs to me, like I just feel, wow, this is wonderful. But and I suppose most of us who work with children's books and in children's libraries feel that tremendous bonding with that space. And I suppose it's important to remember that, not everybody does. And for some people, it is not a feeling of a friendly space. It's a feeling of a kind of possibly, in some ways, a place that could get you into trouble somehow. So I think remembering all the different attitudes that people bring to books and literature, which are not always positive, I suppose. So it's but look, like anything, it requires, as everybody listening to me knows, tremendous perseverance and patience and warmth and encouragement for children to feel comfortable in a space in a library and to feel comfortable with choosing books, confident with books, and loving books.
You reminded me when you said that some people have that fear of like punitive repercussions in a library. Of a podcast I listened to a while ago about the different ways that libraries approach fines. And I was just wondering, it just made me think, do you have any thoughts about fines for public libraries? Do you think that they can be prohibitive for families and
Well,
borrowers, particularly
you know,
for kids to borrow like large piles of books?
well, personally, I'm completely against library fines, and many public librarians would agree with me, and there would be, I don't know how many public libraries still issue fines. I remember one of my public libraries that I belong to quite a lot, that I went to some years ago. The librarian was saying, "Oh, it's so annoying that we have to issue these fines. It was just because the software was set up like that, so we have to do it." Like it's sort of. I think in general, most public librarians would not be in favour of library fines. I think you'll find, on the whole, I can't speak for all public libraries, but I think that is something perhaps from the past.
I think I mean, I think that's true. But I think it sort of speaks to that difficulty that we were talking about earlier of how to articulate that further up, because it seems to me like, we don't need to convince librarians of the importance of access for their communities. They know, we don't need to tell them how to suck eggs. And similarly in schools, we don't need to tell teachers the importance of having library staff in the library to make it that kind of community place. But then there seems to be this dissonance between what those people in those spaces know versus what they are then able to achieve based on, the administration or the government or the funding. And it reminds me then of what you said earlier about the libraries being set up and really celebrated when they were first established, like post-war. Do you think that we have lost that sense of them being an important place?
Well, I don't think that's the case with public libraries. Public libraries, I think, are thriving. They're doing fantastically well, and many municipalities are building brand new public libraries as their flagship building, much more than the town hall, as a sort of community space where every municipality must have a library. That sort of sense. So the public libraries, I think, are doing very well. I mean, you can never take anything for granted. But it's certainly true that within the school system, in all, the school systems across Australia, as we know, are very complicated, with many varieties of school and many varieties of governance. But I have certainly been to schools where the librarian might have booked me in to come and give a talk a year beforehand, and I turn up a year later, and the poor librarian says to me, "Oh, well, the head of the diocese or whatever decided that we didn't need libraries in any of our school network anymore, and now it's a learning space, and all the books have been redistributed into different rooms across the school." That's exactly what you're talking about. That there's sort of this. But again, it seems to me a complete misunderstanding of what a library is. I think that is an example of somebody who thinks a library is a version of Google, that are no longer necessary. And certainly, in New South Wales recently, in a fabulous brand new 17-story public school, high school was built without a specific dedicated library. And those sorts of decisions, I think, are kind of devastating and strange. And it's not that librarians are lying down and taking it. They know the value of what they're doing, and they're fighting for it. And that certainly is a powerful part of any opportunity I would get as a laureate to talk to people higher up the band, to try and just it's a little bit like trying to get a reluctant child to learn to read. It's going to require massive patience, perseverance, sort of repetition, human warmth, to try and communicate look, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there would not be a person alive that would say, oh, reading's not important. Like everybody agrees reading is important. And yet they seem, in some instances, they don't seem able to understand that where is a child going to read? Sitting in the classroom, you will learn to read, but learning to love to read takes time and space and opportunity, and that's a library. We don't want a society, such an affluent society here in Australia. Who wants a society where only a sort of elite of privileged people are good readers, and the rest of us are just, good at reading messages on our phone? It's sort of crazy.
Yeah.
It's a misunderstanding of maybe of what a library is and what the task of learning to love to read is.
And have you seen any particularly innovative programs in your work as Laureate or in the libraries that I'm sure that you've been to throughout your career that have managed to create really exciting spaces for young readers that...
Oh, well, look, I've seen, over 30 years, I've seen so many. They're wonderful. But of course, I'm being, I'm being selected to go and speak at schools over the past 30 years by very motivated librarians who have wonderful libraries. That's why they, and presumably are being supported by their principal, who will allow the cost of having Ursula come and speak to the children in the library. So what I'm trying to say is I'm seeing this sort of self-selected group of fantastic, vital, loving librarians, and you just see how the children love to be in the library. All the children, that they feel it's a space for them, and they tumble in excitement, and they feel happy. Whereas I occasionally, as that library that was full of basketball hoops, what will happen is if the librarian leaves and gets another job somewhere else, they just won't replace the librarian. They think, well, that wasn't necessary somehow. We'll cope. Who wants a library? We'll cope without it. And that can certainly happen. And, so I suppose, I guess you wish people could do a wonderful tour of, perhaps we could do a virtual tour of all these wonderful libraries all over Australia, where you just see such, sort of motivated and excited children just lying around the library, feeling completely at home with books, is how you would hope for everybody's childhood.
What role do you think that booksellers play in that network, particularly children's booksellers, which it seems to me are quite a different beast in some ways?
Well, I mean, the booksellers are wonderful, and you can imagine I've also visited lots of children's bookshops, and they are also, in a sense, like libraries. The children's bookshops are places where children feel they're in a space where they're welcome, and they're inevitably... Look, it's funny, isn't it? I remember talking to somebody when one of my kids was in hospital, and everybody in the children's hospital was so nice. Everyone was so nice. And of course, as soon as you go to the adult hospital, there's a very gloomy atmosphere, and people think you need to be nice to children. They remember, but they forget you have to be nice to adults as well. And in a way, children's bookshops are like that. The people who run children's bookshops are just sort of really nice to children, and they know a lot about books. And look, obviously during the COVID, I think there has been a lot of selling of children's books, although I have to admit the last article I read about that, it seemed the biggest sellers were television program related books and sort of puzzle books. So that's not exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about reading. I mean, that's great, fantastic, and obviously it's great for the booksellers who have to make a living, but it's not quite... I don't think a children's bookshop, it's possible to, it doesn't replace a library. I think, look, I would encourage everybody to go to the bookshop for presents for children, because they're beautiful. Children's books are so beautifully produced these days, and I think, or to give book vouchers and so on. But for the children's booksellers, of course, they rely a lot on their income selling to school libraries. So the two entities are very deeply connected with each other. And so the children's booksellers know exactly, they have quite very close relationships with school libraries and librarians. So they work together. I mean, you could sort of make an argument that they're, in competition with each other, but I don't really, I've never heard a children's bookseller say that to me, that what children's booksellers thrive on are children who read and who love reading, and parents who notice that and will take the child to the bookshop and get them a book. I guess, it's obviously a wonderful and very special experience as a child, but it's not one that you can do too often, is take your child to the bookshop because of expense and say, pick a book for yourself. Like that's a magical thing that you can do for a child. But A, you can't do it that often, and B, not every child will be in that lucky position. And we want all our children to be, great readers.
Yeah. So this brings me to really nicely to a question that came through from one of our audience members, which is about challenging issues for 12-year-olds facing a fear of secondary school. Now, I hope that to whoever asked that I'm going to do your question justice here, because it could mean a number of things, I think. But I wanted to say public libraries in particular are obviously incredibly important in bridging this kind of middle years gap from perhaps feeling really at home in your primary school library to the big daunting world of a secondary school library, if there is one at your secondary school, as we've said. And I wonder, Ursula, as somebody whose work spans across so many ages, when you're writing for these middle years readers who are potentially on the verge of either going into secondary school or they've just entered secondary school, are there particular themes or issues that you write about in books that are just for them, or things that you think that they're facing that are unique?
Look, it's interesting. I mean, one question I often get asked is, are there things you can't write about? Are there sort of taboos in children's books or young adult books? And I don't think there are any taboos. I think you can write about anything you want. It just, in a sense, depends. It requires a certain sensitivity, as you would if you were talking about some things to a 12-year-old child. You would talk about it in a different way to how you might talk about it to an adult peer. So I guess it's interesting, isn't it? For example, something that will happen to me, say when I'm signing books at a festival or something like that, a parent might come up with, say, an 8-year-old child and will say, oh, but she's a very good reader, so I picked X book, say a book I've written called The Red Shoe, which has got some quite, pretty tough things going on inside it. And I know perfectly well that this 8-year-old girl will be able to read that book. My books are written in fairly straightforward English, and if she's a good reader, she'll be able to read it. But it won't have much meaning to her. That's sort of a misunderstanding, I suppose, of what is a good reader. It's you want to read things that carry meaning for you. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say in answer to that is I think it's very hard to that's the challenge of a librarian, isn't it? That the collection, that's a massive challenge. What do we put in our collection? What kind of books do we represent there for the children of this, or young adults of this school? And it's the same challenge for public libraries. In fact, perhaps it's the biggest, or at least one of the most significant tasks of a librarian, is what they choose to put in their collection. And I suppose my argument would be to make it as comprehensive as possible, given the constraints of money, space, the particular school you're in, the governance of that school, which might not allow certain sorts of books. I guess, so I suppose I'm a little bit, I'm wondering about that question. I guess. I think it's hard. I suppose what I mean is I find it's hard to sort of think of a group and cater for them, because within that group there'll be such a variety of needs and desires. And some people, as you know, some people want to read about people like themselves, and some people do not want to read about people like themselves. You know, some people respond deeply to realist fiction, and some people are frightened by realist fiction. And if they want to think about certain issues, they're going to respond to fantasy fiction or some other sort of metaphorical fiction. So I think it's probably, that question is probably pinpointed the one of the hardest challenges for librarians, which is about what books do they put on the shelf in their library, in the space.
And what advice then would you give to librarians who, like, I know when I've spoken to librarians in the past, a lot, particularly in schools, particularly for that age group, struggle with parents coming back to them and saying, you know, my kid has picked up this book, which I think is horrifically inappropriate. How dare you have it on the shelves? Do you have any advice for navigating those conversations around what's appropriate or inappropriate?
Look, I mean, I feel for librarians, because again, it's hard, isn't it? It's because the fact remains, a child can be very, very frightened by a book. You know, literature is very powerful, and I think it's probably wrong to dismiss such concerns altogether. Do you know what I mean? As a sort of, you know, controlling neurotic parent. That might well be the case, right? But it is also true that children can be deeply affected by what they read, and some children, you know, are extremely and unexpectedly sensitive. So I think it's sort of diminishing the power of literature to sort of say that, oh, you can, you know, people should just read whatever they like, and you know, and toughen up or something like that. I think that's so. Again, look, one of my own books, I remember, this is a few years ago, I was at a library, a school library, very nice school library, and this is some years ago, I'd written a book called The First Book of Samuel. You know, this is going to sound very unexpected, but the librarian told me very apologetically she wasn't allowed to have that book in her library because the parents were divorced. This was a Catholic school. And it's sort of funny because there were quite a lot of things in that book, and I would have suggested the divorce was the least problematic, but or problematic, what a ridiculous word, was the least, was the mildest of various issues in the book. So I think those sorts of things just happen unexpectedly. And I think librarians are probably very used to being very diplomatic and calm. And I guess if they really, you know, believe in the comprehensive nature of a collection, which I tend to, you know, that they could just, I suppose they might thank the parent for alerting them to it, and now they know that for their child, you know, that's not a book that, you know, they will take home. They might read it at school. I don't know. I mean, I think those are sorts of very thorny issues to deal with. Good one to raise.
Navigate. I've got one more audience question before we wrap up, and that is this. So they've just said, you mentioned that libraries are not seen as safe havens for many young people and children. What can libraries do to change this, and what support might they need? Which is a great question. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. I mean, I think libraries are safe havens for children, but it might be the perceptions of the children that you have to be patient with, that not all children regard. I suppose I was particularly thinking then of public libraries, which, you know, I mean, I know a friend of mine who, you know, is sort of well-educated, sort of middle-class person. She grew up in a nice part of Sydney, North Sydney. She told me that when she was a child, she didn't know what the public library was. She would walk past it thinking it was like the TAB or something, somewhere where she wasn't allowed to go in. Like those sorts of perceptions are kind of shocking. And I suppose they're worth bearing in mind that they can occur anywhere. And that's partly why perhaps some people higher up in government don't understand what a library's for. They've possibly never been inside one. So I guess it's about, making sure to invite people in to the library, children, adults, all sorts of people, so they understand what a library is. And I suppose it would be wonderful for public librarians to be invited to schools to talk to the children, and I'm sure they are all over the place. So I think I sort of feel embarrassed because I'm sure all the people sitting listening to Ursula rabbiting on is thinking, well, yes, we've been doing that for the past 50 years, and I know that librarians are the most wonderful sort of promoters of and lovers of where they work. So, but I think it's just a matter of, we have two contrasting families in my own experience. One, the refugee family whose parents felt the library had a certain menace of, government authority, and the other one from this sort of middle-class Sydney background who thought it was like the TAB, it was just for poor people or something. I don't know what she thought, So, because neither of those views were ever in my head, they're kind of, I'm always taken aback by the views that people have of public libraries. So I guess it's and libraries in general. So I guess it's always worth asking people, do you go to your public library? Anybody, have you been to the library lately? And just finding out what they know about their public library.
And just to quickly follow on from that then, because I know, when I first had my son, there was a lot of talk about utilising the public library, and I think that a lot of new parents get told about public libraries. Do you think that there needs to be additional messaging for teens to reach out to them again? Do you think that they have the potential to fall through the cracks in terms of engaging with libraries?
Oh, look, that's right, and indeed, children in Australia read reasonably well at 8, and by the time they're teens, the sort of statistical tests show that the reading levels drop. So, and that said, it is possible to make teen-friendly spaces in libraries, and I've certainly been to libraries that are full of teenagers. So it's not a natural way of things. I think teens love public spaces where they can sort of hang around and be, and I think they clearly love to be amongst books. And I think even just being amongst the books, even if they don't pull the books off the shelves, that just seems to me a really positive thing to have in your psyche, about books, that you have this positive association with books and reading and this thing called the library. So I suppose, teenagers, of course, are sort of, they're sort of running on their own trajectory, so they don't want, I suppose, too much sort of interference. But it would just be about, in public libraries, I making very teenage-friendly spaces, which I know many of them do, so that they don't, as you say, dedicated libraries till the age of 10 and then never go back, that kind of thing.
In the libraries that you've seen a lot of teens in, whether they're using the books or just utilising the space of the library, what do they have in common? What do you think that teen engaging library has in common, if it was one thing?
Well, probably, I think what it indicates is that library is welcoming them. It's not sort of telling them to, looking at them frostily or making them feel unwelcome. I think, I don't know, but that has to be my assumption, that there is a kind of decision in that library that we will welcome teenagers. And I think in all libraries, that's a kind of, that's the most significant thing, isn't it? And that is why school librarians are so militant to promote the presence of a librarian in a library, because it's that human warmth, that human welcome, that come in here, you're welcome here, this place is for you, that is so critical for people wanting to be in a space instead of wanting to get out of it as soon as possible.
Well, Ursula, that brings us to the end of our session, and I actually can't think of a nicer note to end on. We are, of course, going to be talking more at 5. For those of you who are listening to this who perhaps want to come along, the event link is on the Wheeler Centre page. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much, Ursula, for chatting with me. And good luck.
Thank you, librarians. Thank you, Bec.